The morning air hung thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation as James Dean strode across the Warner Bros lot, his canvas bag slung carelessly over one shoulder. Summer in Los Angeles had been merciless that year, the kind of heat that seemed to simmer the asphalt and leave everyone's tempers as short as their patience. Dean squinted against the glare, nodding briefly to a group of studio hands who called his name. At 24, he'd already finished East of Eden, but it was this film, Rebel Without a Cause, that had Hollywood buzzing. Inside Soundstage 16, the temperature somehow managed to be worse. Massive arc lights beat down on the carefully constructed set of the police station scene, where Dean was scheduled to film one of the most pivotal confrontations in the movie. The room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major studio production, grips adjusting light stands, makeup artists dabbing sweat from extras' foreheads, and director Nicholas Ray huddled with cinematographer Ernest Haller, gesturing intensely at the composition sheet. "There he is, our troubled youth," said Natalie Wood, 19 and luminous in her role as Judy. She perched on a folding chair at the edge of the set, script open on her lap, dark eyes following Dean as he navigated through the crowd of crew members. Dean offered her a half-smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes but had already made him the subject of fan mail stacks that grew taller by the day at the Warner publicity office. "Morning, Natalie. Sal here yet?" "Makeup," she replied, gesturing toward the trailers outside. "He's been there an hour already. Something about getting his hair just right." Dean nodded, running a hand through his own disheveled, sandy hair, a deliberate contrast to Sal Mineo's carefully styled look as Plato, the third point in their troubled teenage triangle. While Mineo fussed over every detail, Dean had developed a reputation for showing up looking like he'd just rolled out of bed, somehow making it part of his mystique. "Dean," Nicholas Ray's voice cut through the background noise. The director waved him over, sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead. At 44, Ray was old enough to be Dean's father, but possessed a youthful energy that had quickly established a rapport between them. "Got a minute?" Dean wove through cables and equipment to join Ray at the monitors. "What's up, Nick?" "The confrontation scene. I've been thinking," Ray said, lowering his voice. "The script has you delivering those lines to your father pretty straightforward, but I want more. This is where everything breaks for Jim Stark. This is where we see the facade crack." Dean nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the set where Jim Backus, playing his father, was already in costume, the suit and tie of middle-class respectability that suffocated his character's son. "I know what that feels like," Dean said quietly, and Ray knew better than to press. Dean's relationship with his own father had been strained since his mother's death when he was 9, a biographical detail that gave weight to his portrayal of troubled youth. "Just keep it real," Ray said, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's all I'm asking. When the cameras roll, forget the marks, forget the lights. Just be the kid who can't take it anymore." Dean nodded again, more decisively this time. "I'll get into wardrobe." 40 minutes later, the iconic red windbreaker hugged Dean's shoulders as he stood at his mark on the police station set. The jacket had been Ray's idea, a splash of rebellious color against the institutional grays and blues of the station. It had become a visual shorthand for everything the film represented: youth, defiance, vulnerability beneath a tough exterior. "This is take 3 on scene 47, the assistant director called out. "Police station confrontation, interior." Dean closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the character. Around him, the set had fallen into the hushed anticipation that preceded filming. Jim Backus stood a few feet away, already in character as the ineffectual father. Marietta Canty, playing the family's housekeeper, waited in the background. "Sound. Rolling. Camera. Rolling." Ray settled into his director's chair. "Action!" The scene began with practiced precision. Dean's character, Jim Stark, paced the small waiting area of the police station, while his father fussed and worried about the implications of his son's delinquent behavior. The dialogue flowed naturally for the first minute. The father's concerns about appearances, the neighbors, what people would think, all the superficial worries that drove Jim Stark toward his rebellion. Then came the pivotal moment, the emotional core where Jim finally confronts his father about his weakness, his inability to stand up to Jim's mother, his failure to be the man his son desperately needed him to be. It was a moment that required perfect timing, building tension, and authentic emotion. Dean turned to deliver his line, and nothing came. His mouth opened slightly, but the carefully memorized words had vanished. For 3 agonizing seconds, the set remained frozen in expectation. A camera operator shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed softly in the darkness beyond the lights. Dean's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the look of an actor who had committed the cardinal sin of forgetting his lines. In the director's chair, Ray leaned forward, his hand hovering near his mouth, ready to call cut and reset the scene. But Dean didn't break character. Instead, something subtle shifted in his posture, a tightening of his shoulders, a slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. The pause extended, transforming from an actor's mistake into a character's emotional paralysis. The crew watched, transfixed. This wasn't in the script, this wasn't planned. But somehow, it felt right. A teenager so overcome with emotion that words failed him. Jim Backus, professional to his core, stayed in the moment, his expression changing from parental frustration to confusion at his son's silence. "Jim," he said, adding an unscripted prompt, "what is it you want to say to me?" The improvised line gave Dean the opening he needed. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the police station as if looking for escape. The silence had become electric, a tangible thing that filled the soundstage and held everyone captive. Dean ran a hand through his hair, that now famous gesture that teenagers across America would soon imitate, and muttered something inaudible. "What was that?" Backus pressed, still improvising. Dean's gaze snapped up, something new burning in his eyes. Later, crew members would describe it as the moment James Dean disappeared completely, leaving only Jim Stark, raw, wounded, and desperately trying to be understood. "You're tearing me apart," Dean finally exploded, the line emerging with such genuine anguish that several crew members visibly flinched. "You say one thing, she says another, and everybody changes back again." The words weren't delivered as written. They were rougher, less polished, but infinitely more real. The unfiltered cry of a young man caught between warring parents, between childhood and adulthood, between conformity and authenticity. Ray leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. He made no move to stop the scene. Dean continued, now fully immersed in the character's breakdown, his forgotten lines replaced by something more powerful. Truth. Each word seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him, each gesture authentically his own, rather than something choreographed by the movement coach. The cameras rolled on, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming the emotional cornerstone of the entire film. In the shadowy edges of the set, crew members exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the kind of raw performance that transcended acting and touched something universal. When the scene finally wound down, the soundstage remained eerily silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft, mechanical whir of the cameras still rolling. Ray waited a beat longer than necessary before quietly saying, "Cut." Dean stood motionless, his breathing ragged, sweat beading on his forehead under the hot lights. For a moment, he looked disoriented, as if emerging from a trance. Then his eyes met Ray's across the set, a silent question in them. The director said nothing at first, simply removed his sunglasses and studied Dean with an intensity that made several crew members shift uncomfortably. "I think," Ray finally said, "we just found the heart of this picture." As the crew began to stir, preparing for the next setup, Dean stepped away from the set, shrugging off the red jacket and handing it to a waiting costume assistant. His hands trembled slightly, the after effect of the emotional exertion. "You okay?" Natalie Wood had appeared at his side, her expression concerned. Dean glanced at her, a genuine smile briefly replacing his usual guarded expression. "Yeah, just got lost for a minute there." "Well," she said, "if that's what happens when you get lost, maybe you should lose your way more often." Behind them, Ray was already instructing the script supervisor to make note of the changes, to capture the raw energy of what had just happened. Tomorrow they would film the famous knife fight scene outside the observatory, but everyone on that soundstage knew they had just witnessed the true moment when Rebel Without a Cause had found its soul, and it had come not from careful planning or perfect execution, but from the very thing the film itself celebrated, the beautiful imperfection of youth. Time seemed to stand still on Soundstage 16. What should have been a brief moment of forgotten dialogue had stretched into something else entirely, something unplanned yet mesmerizing. The silence that enveloped the set wasn't empty. It was charged with potential, like the air before a summer storm. Dean stood frozen at his mark, the red jacket suddenly feeling too tight across his shoulders. To everyone watching, those few seconds of silence felt interminable. The boom operator shifted his weight from one foot to another. A makeup artist unconsciously held her powder puff mid-air. Even the usually restless extras playing police officers remained perfectly still, as if afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had descended upon the set. In the control booth, the sound engineer glanced nervously at his levels, wondering if the recording equipment had somehow failed. But the needles were moving slightly, picking up the soft ambient noises of the set, the nearly imperceptible hum of the lights, someone's quiet breathing, the distant rumble of activity elsewhere on the Warner lot. Director Nicholas Ray's fingers tapped once, twice against the arm of his chair, but he made no move to stop the cameras. His instincts, honed through years of working with actors, told him to wait, to see what would emerge from this unscripted moment. Dean lowered his head, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed if not for the camera's unflinching eye. His fingers, those expressive hands that seemed to speak even when he was silent, trembled slightly before he ran them through his hair in what would become one of cinema's most imitated gestures. The movement wasn't calculated. It was pure instinct, the physical manifestation of internal struggle. Then came the mutter, low at first, almost inaudible, forcing everyone on set to lean forward slightly. Can't ever get it right. Never enough. The words weren't from the script. They weren't even complete sentences. They were fragments of thought, verbalized unconsciously as Dean fought to find his way back to the scene. But in the context of Jim Stark, the troubled teenager caught between demanding parents and his own sense of identity, these improvised mutterings carried perfect emotional truth. Jim Backus, still in character as Jim's father, looked genuinely confused. The script called for him to be defensive, even dismissive of his son's emotional outburst. But faced with this unexpected silence, this vulnerable moment, Backus's expression softened into something more complex. Concern mixed with the helplessness of a parent who doesn't know how to reach their child. "Son," Backus said gently, improvising, his hand half raised as if to touch Dean's shoulder but stopping short. The simple word seemed to trigger something in Dean. His posture changed, shoulders hunching slightly in a gesture that managed to convey both defiance and vulnerability. Anyone who had ever been a teenager, who had ever felt misunderstood, trapped, or desperate to be seen, would recognize that body language instantly. In the shadows beyond the lights, Natalie Wood watched intently from where she stood with the script supervisor. She hadn't been called to set yet. This wasn't her scene, but she had stayed to observe Dean work. Now she found herself holding her breath, recognizing that she was witnessing something rare and genuine. "What's happening?" whispered a young production assistant to one of the camera operators. "Magic," came the hushed reply. "Just watch." The awkward pause had transformed. What had begun as a mistake, a professional stumble, had evolved into a moment of raw authenticity. Dean wasn't acting anymore. He was embodying the inarticulate frustration of youth. Every teenager who had ever stood before authority figures, desperate to explain feelings they themselves barely understood, was there in his silence. Ray leaned forward in his chair, eyes never leaving Dean. This was why he had fought to cast this difficult, sometimes unpredictable young actor. This was what set Dean apart, his ability to strip away performance and reveal truth. The pause had lasted only seconds in real time, but it felt longer to everyone present, a suspended moment when cinema transcended its technical constraints and touched something real. There was beauty in this imperfection, this human moment of forgetfulness that had somehow revealed more than the perfect recitation of scripted lines ever could. And then, just as the tension seemed about to break, just as the director might finally call "cut" and reset the scene, Dean's head snapped up. His eyes, previously downcast in that troubled silence, now blazed with intensity. Whatever internal struggle had silenced him had clearly reached its breaking point. The awkward pause was over. What came next would leave everyone on set speechless. The transformation happened in an instant. One moment, James Dean stood in silent struggle. The next, he exploded into motion with such force that Jim Backus instinctively stepped backward. Dean grabbed the nearest wooden chair, an authentic police station prop, and slammed it against the wall with a crash that echoed through the soundstage. "You're tearing me apart," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion that couldn't possibly be feigned. The line was in the script, but not like this. Not delivered with this raw, almost painful intensity. You say one thing, she says another, and everybody changes back again. The words ripped from his throat, each syllable charged with the frustration of youth confronting incomprehensible adulthood. But what happened next wasn't in any script. Dean advanced on Backus, his hands gesturing wildly, his entire body communicating what words alone never could. "Do you even see me?" Dean demanded, improvising completely now, his face inches from Backus's. "Or am I just something you have to deal with? Something you have to fix because I embarrass you?" Backus, a veteran actor with years of stage and screen experience, recognized immediately that something extraordinary was happening. Rather than try to guide the scene back to the scripted dialogue, he made a split-second decision to follow Dean's lead, responding to the emotional truth of the moment rather than the written page. "Jim, that's not fair," Backus countered, his voice carrying the wounded dignity of a father who doesn't understand why his best intentions always seem to fall short. "Everything I do for you." "No," Dean shouted, turning away in frustration, then spinning back. "You do it for you, so you can tell yourself you're a good father, so you can sleep at night." In the director's chair, Nicholas Ray sat perfectly still, barely breathing. He'd wanted authenticity when he cast Dean, had fought with studio executives who preferred more conventional, less troublesome actors. Now he was witnessing exactly why that fight had been worth it. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every unscripted moment of this emotional hurricane. Marietta Canty, playing the family's housekeeper, watched the scene unfold from her position near the edge of the set. Her face registered genuine shock. Not acting, but real surprise at the intensity Dean was bringing to what should have been a straightforward scene. When the camera briefly caught her expression, it captured something that no direction could have created. The authentic reaction of an adult witnessing a young person's emotional breakdown. "I tried to talk to her," Dean continued, his voice dropping suddenly, the shift from shouting to near whisper creating a dramatic tension that made everyone lean forward. "I try to talk to you. Nobody listens." He turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the red jacket stark against the muted colors of the police station set. This vulnerable posture, this physical embodiment of teenage isolation, was something no acting coach had taught him. It came from somewhere else, somewhere personal. Across the set, Ann Doran, who played Jim's mother, watched from the sidelines. She wasn't in this particular scene but had come to observe, knowing its importance to the story. Her hand covered her mouth, eyes wide at the raw display unfolding before her. Tomorrow she would film her own confrontations with Dean, and she was already mentally rewriting her approach, knowing she'd need to match this new emotional benchmark. "I don't know what to do anymore," Backus responded, the strain evident in his voice. He was no longer just acting the part of Jim Stark's father. He was responding as a father would to this unfiltered pain. "Tell me what to do." The pleading in his voice, the admission of parental helplessness, created a shift in the dynamic that no one had anticipated. The script called for conflict, for the father's continued ineffectuality, but this improvised admission of confusion opened something new, a window of genuine connection between father and son. Dean turned slowly, his face transformed. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had deepened into something more complex. Disappointment mixed with the desperate desire to be understood. "Stand up," he said quietly, the two words carrying the weight of every child's wish for a parent to be stronger than they are. Just once. Stand up. The line wasn't in the screenplay, yet it crystallized the entire relationship more perfectly than pages of dialogue could have. In that moment, everyone on set understood exactly what Rebel Without a Cause was truly about. Not juvenile delinquency, not teenage rebellion, but the universal search for authenticity in a world of compromises. The rest of the scene unfolded in this new emotional territory, part scripted, part improvised, all truth. Dean moved around the set with unpredictable energy, at times explosive, at times eerily still. The camera operators followed as best they could, sometimes catching moments slightly out of focus or imperfectly framed, technical imperfections that only added to the scene's documentary-like realism. When Dean finally delivered the scripted climax of the scene, "You're not going to use me as an excuse again," the line carried such weight that several crew members later reported feeling tears spring to their eyes. What had begun as a forgotten line had transformed into the most powerful sequence in the film. As the scene naturally wound down, Dean stood in the center of the set, breathing hard, sweat visible on his forehead under the lights. The emotional exertion was plainly visible. This wasn't an actor pretending to be exhausted. This was genuine depletion after giving everything to the moment. Ray waited until the perfect instant of dramatic resolution before quietly saying, "Cut," but no one moved. No one called for the next setup. No one reached for a light to adjust or a prop to reset. The soundstage remained in perfect, stunned silence. What they had just witnessed wasn't acting in any conventional sense. It was life itself, somehow captured on film, the mysterious alchemy that happens when technical craft meets emotional truth and creates something greater than either could alone. In that suspended moment, everyone present understood they had just participated in something that transcended ordinary filmmaking. They had witnessed the transformation of cinema from entertainment into art, from storytelling into truth-telling. They had seen James Dean not just perform a role, but inhabit it so completely that the line between actor and character had momentarily ceased to exist, and no one knew quite what to say. The silence that followed Nicholas Ray's quiet cut wasn't the usual bustling aftermath of a successful take. There was no immediate return to the organized chaos of a working film set, no calls for the next setup, no adjustments of lights or camera positions, no script supervisors comparing notes. Instead, a profound stillness had settled over Soundstage 16, as if everyone present needed time to process what they had just witnessed. In the control booth, the sound engineer slowly removed his headphones and placed them on the console, his movements deliberate and almost reverent. He'd recorded hundreds of scenes over his career, but nothing like this. He caught the eye of his assistant and nodded once, a silent confirmation that they both understood the significance of what had just happened. On the lighting platform above, a veteran gaffer who had worked on films since the silent era leaned against a railing, his weathered face unreadable. He had illuminated scenes for the greatest actors in Hollywood, had seen the industry transform from black and white to technicolor, from silence to sound. Yet something about Dean's raw performance had affected even him, cutting through decades of professional detachment. Near the cameras, the cinematographer Ernest Haller, who had filmed Gone with the Wind and worked with legends like Bette Davis, stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the camera. There was a subtle shake to his fingers that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with emotion. He'd captured something today that went beyond technical excellence, beyond composition and lighting. He'd captured truth. Dean himself hadn't moved from his final position. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, his face still flushed with the after-effects of the emotional storm that had just passed through him. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, as if returning from somewhere far away. His eyes, when they finally focused, held a question as they met Ray's across the set. Ray slowly rose from his director's chair. In his decades making films, from his breakthrough They Live by Night to his recent work with Humphrey Bogart, he had developed a reputation for coaxing remarkable performances from his actors. But even he seemed moved by what had just unfolded. "I think," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with quiet authority, "we can all agree that's the one." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, not quite relief, but a collective exhalation, moved through the crew. The spell was broken, but the reverence remained. Jim Backus approached Dean, extending his hand in a gesture that was both professional acknowledgement and genuine respect. "I've been acting for 20 years, he said quietly, so that only Dean and those closest could hear. "I've never seen anything like that." Dean accepted the handshake with uncharacteristic humility. "I forgot the lines," he admitted, a half-smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "No," Backus replied, his hand still gripping Dean's. "You found them. Across the set, Ann Doran and Natalie Wood exchanged glances. As the actresses playing the women in Jim Stark's life, his overbearing mother and the girl who might understand him, they recognized that the bar had just been raised impossibly high. Their scenes with Dean would need to match the emotional authenticity he had just demonstrated. "God help us tomorrow," Doran murmured, but there was admiration rather than dread in her voice. Sal Mineo, who had arrived on set midway through the take and had watched from the shadows, approached now. At 16, he was the youngest of the three leads, playing Plato, the troubled boy who forms an attachment to Dean's character. His expression was one of unconcealed awe. "That was," he began, then shook his head, unable to find the right words. Dean reached out and ruffled Mineo's carefully styled hair, breaking the tension with a gesture that was both brotherly and slightly mischievous. "That was just jazz, kid," he said, deflecting the unspoken praise with the cool understatement that was becoming his trademark. But everyone knew it was more than that. Ray had moved to the center of the set now, gathering his key crew members for a brief conference. "We need to adjust the shooting schedule," he was saying. "After what just happened, I want to rethink our approach to several scenes." The script supervisor, a meticulous woman who had frantically been noting every deviation from the screenplay, looked up with concern. "But Mr. Ray, the studio will understand when they see the dailies." Ray interrupted with the confident authority of a director who knew he had just captured cinematic gold. "What happened here today changes things." Meanwhile, Dean had retreated to a quiet corner of the soundstage. He shrugged out of the red jacket, handing it carefully to a wardrobe assistant who accepted it with something approaching reverence, as if it had been transformed into an artifact of significance. Dean rolled his shoulders, physically shaking off the intensity of the scene. A young production assistant approached him tentatively, offering a cup of coffee. "That was really something, Mr. Dean," he said, his voice betraying his youth and enthusiasm. Dean accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "What's your name?" he asked. "Dennis," the young man replied, surprised to be asked. "You want to direct someday, Dennis?" Dean's question was surprisingly perceptive. "How did you know?" Dean smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually guarded face. "The way you watch everything, not just the actors, the whole process." The assistant nodded, slightly embarrassed at being so transparent. "Remember what happened today," Dean said, his voice taking on an unusual earnestness. "This business, it's not about saying the right words or hitting the right marks. It's about truth. Sometimes you find it in the script. Sometimes," he shrugged, that characteristic gesture that seemed to communicate volumes. "Sometimes you find it when everything goes wrong." Across the soundstage, preparations were finally beginning for the next setup. The spell had broken, and the machinery of filmmaking was grinding back into motion. But it wasn't the same. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of Soundstage 16, a new understanding that had spread through everyone present. What they had witnessed wasn't just a good take or even a great performance. It was a reminder of why they had all been drawn to cinema in the first place: its capacity to capture moments of genuine human experience, to freeze truth in time and preserve it. As the day wore on and other scenes were filmed, the moment was already calcifying into legend. Crew members who hadn't been present heard about it during breaks, each retelling adding subtle embellishments until by day's end, it had become the definitive story of why James Dean wasn't just another handsome young actor, but an artist of rare authenticity. In later years, many who had been on set that day in the summer of 1955 would point to that single take as the moment they understood what set Dean apart. Some would claim they knew then that he would become an icon, though none could have foreseen how tragically brief his career would be, cut short just months later on a California highway. But on that day, in that moment of profound silence that followed his performance, what they recognized was simpler and more fundamental. They had witnessed not just acting, but being, the rare, almost alchemical transformation of forgotten lines into unforgettable truth.